Well, you probably have your Hebrew Bibles with you tonight. And I think I asked you to bring your Apocrypha. And what you need tonight is your Josephus. I don't think we'll use either one of those, probably. Hallelujah. I tricked you on that one. Supposed to read my mind, I guess. No, we may look at something in the Apocrypha. I was going to deal with something else tonight. The reason that I'm not looking at that now is because in my mind it doesn't fit here chronologically. And to save my life, I can't seem to get an agreement with the generally accepted conservative position about a certain topic here. And since I'm not in agreement with that, then where I had it in my notes to try to go along with others, it just doesn't fit because I think it comes 100 years later than what's generally believed. So we'll teach that. We are going to deal with that, but I'm going to deal with it later on. Now let's look in Daniel, see where we were. There is a break of somewhat a little bit over 50 years between this 5th and 6th verse in Daniel 11. Now verse 5 was important because it gives us the founding fathers of these two important dynasties, of the Ptolemies and of the Seleucids. And every now and then, and tonight is one of those every now and thens, we have to take a break from looking at the text of Daniel 11 because fill-in material has to be given between verses 5 and 6. My intention tonight is to supply you with the information that fits between verses 5 and 6, which will prepare us for looking at verse 6 later. It will connect with that then. There's a time gap of something over 50 years, evidently, between these two verses. We're going to look some tonight, Lord willing, if we have time toward the end, at intertestamental Jewish high priesthood, just with the part that deals with the time period we're going to cover. So we're really going to use a lot your intertestamental period chart. You'll need to have that available. Let's pick up where we were last week, talking about the two founding fathers of these dynasties, Seleucus the first and Ptolemy the first. Seleucus the first and Ptolemy the first. Ptolemy, or rather Seleucus, we've given you a date of his reign from 311 to 281, or from 311 to 292. The 92 to 81 period is a co-ruling period, which we'll discuss more in a moment. We've already given you just about all the information possible about him. One thing that the angel, however, says about Seleucus, remember, who was the prince, according to verse 5, of Ptolemy the first, not of Alexander, but of Ptolemy the first, is that his kingdom is going to be strong. He's going to be strong above the leader from whom he comes, Ptolemy the first in Egypt. The end of verse 5, and he'll have a dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion. Now, initially, and probably it was only for a relatively short period of time, perhaps we could consider defining the time period of the end of verse 5 is a little bit difficult. Perhaps we could consider the empire of Seleucus being a little more stable than that of Ptolemy the first. However, the angel immediately, beginning in verse 6, and going on for a number of verses, the angel immediately switches the train of thought from the strength of the kingdom of Seleucus to the strength of the kingdom of Ptolemy. Because the Ptolemies are the ones who control Palestine from the year 320 BC to the year 198, just over 120 years. They are the ones in control. So in other words, perhaps this reference here, that he shall have dominion and his dominion shall be a great dominion, really refers to the further kingdom of Syria, which will not begin until around 198. It's because this kingdom here is the kingdom that controls Palestine, because it swapped from the hand of the Ptolemies, who have a dynasty in Egypt, from one of Alexander's 4 generals to Seleucus, also a general under Alexander, but one who fled from Antigonus in Babylon down to Ptolemy I in Egypt, became a prince of his, broke off, and according to Daniel 11, verse 5, made his own kingdom in Syria. Now, Seleucus, we've given you, he starts on the chart around 311 when he takes Babylon. This is when he takes Babylon back from Antigonus, who had controlled Babylon up to this time. As a matter of fact, he's the one who had run Seleucus out of the territory when Seleucus had to flee down to Ptolemy in Egypt. And so perhaps this, the end of verse 5 is in reference to what I'm now saying over 100 years from now, rather than immediately to the kingdom of Seleucus I. Because as we'll see in verse 6, the angel immediately, in giving the revelation to the prophet Daniel, takes up the train of thought not of the Seleucid kingdom, but of the Ptolemaic dynasty. So more or less, that's all we can say about Seleucus I. He is the king. He's not called, remember, the king of the north yet, not in verse 5. This doesn't start until verse 6, and of course Seleucus I is not the one under consideration by the time we get down to that verse. But he is the king of the north. Ptolemy I, the king of the south, rules from 323 to 285. The ditto lines on your chart from 285 to 283 speak of his co-rule with his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who will be a main topic of this evening. Most of what we have to say will deal with the Ptolemies, the great patrons of the sciences and of the arts, who make Egypt one of the flourishing empires of the world during this time. It had been, remember, well, over a century before under the pharaohs. But the Hyksos invasion of 730 BC kind of did Egypt in for a long time, and Assyria and Babylon kept the reins tight on the Egyptians, as you can see from the Old Testament historical books, from the histories of the prophets. It's not until the time of the Ptolemies that Egypt becomes again a world-renowned empire. Now, Ptolemy I was one of the great rulers of the ancient world. He and his son, Ptolemy II, are responsible for building and for equipping the famous museum and library in Alexandria. This has come into our considerations before in studying intertestamental period history. He was a great patron of learning, of the arts, and of the sciences. Euclid, who was a famous mathematician, was an individual who taught geometry right in the court of Ptolemy. Scholars were flocking here, in other words, during the reign of the Ptolemies, especially the initial part of their reign in Egypt. Scholars are flocking here. It was said that during the early part of the reign of Ptolemy I, that 14,000 students had migrated to Alexandria, Egypt, who were engaged in studies connected to the museum and or the library, which had now become so famous in Alexandria. They kept botanical and zoological gardens and astronomical observatories and kept them very fastidiously. It was something very important to them. He's a great patron of the arts and of the sciences. Now, this should not be thought to be something strange, because remember Alexander himself, Alexander the Great, whenever he came down into Egypt, he didn't leave Macedon just with a corps of soldiers. What did he take with him? Scientists, mathematicians, archaeologists, of every sort and of every type. He was one who wanted to take these men with him to study, especially down in Egypt, where all the ancient secrets of the world had been locked up for so long. So he more or less is paving the way. Alexander the Great really is the forefather of the Ptolemaic dynasty, because Ptolemy the first and the second and the third, and right on down the list for 14 of the Ptolemies, they're all coming on the heels of Alexander the Great. And he's the one who's bright, not only as a military leader, not only as one who can hold control over the opinions and wills of men, according to Daniel 11, verse 3, but one who's very bright. He was raised on Aristotle, remember, who's very bright, very interested in learning about the sciences and learning about the arts. Ptolemy I had a large army and fleet which controlled the entire Mediterranean Sea. He, of course, made several treks into Palestine, and it was on one of these treks that we've discussed before, as a matter of fact, his first one, that he takes so many Jewish captives back with him into Alexandria, again a city that owes its existence to Alexander the Great, and this establishes a large Jewish population in Alexandria that becomes so important later on, that will become important later on tonight in what we have to say. Now with that in mind, we really round out verse 5, because the dual topic of verse 5 is Seleucus I and Ptolemy I. Now let me show you why we can't jump into verse 6, but we need to explain something about it. We'll get the verses together in connection. The king of the south shall be strong, Ptolemy I, and one of his princes shall be strong above him. Remember, we've stricken out the and he in the King James Version. It appears to read more correctly if they're joined together. This is Seleucus, one of his princes. It's the Tsar, one of the Tsar of the king of the south. And this man, Seleucus I, shall have dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion. And in the end of years, now there is our clue. I don't know if we'll get to that in the Hebrew tonight. If we have enough time, we'll get to that in the Hebrew. But there is the clue to let us know we're not talking about an immediate chronological connection between verses 5 and 6. He says in the end of years. That speaks of the future. He didn't say in the next thing that will happen. But in the end of years. How many doesn't tell us here. It's just an indefinite number. We know because we know the history of this marital alliance, which is the theme of verse 6, which produces the Laodicean War of verses 7 to 9. We know, because of what we know about verse 6, how many years is this? It's over 50 years. Otherwise, it's just an indefinite term. The end of years, they shall join themselves together. They shall join themselves together. But remember, with these pronouns in Daniel 11, it's not reliable just to read along and think right away you know who the they is, and try to connect that to the plurality of persons in verse 5, Ptolemy and Seleucus I. Couldn't be. They're already dead, and they passed off the scene. By the time we get to the date around 250, which is, 60 years later, 61 years later, to be exact, from the period of the founding of the empire of Seleucus I when he takes Babylon in 311. Although really the date's 252, just to round it off around 250. So in the end of years, they, who's they? Well, here he's speaking of successors in the dynasties of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And this is certainly proper and fair to do in prophetical portions of Scripture. One verse does not have to immediately connect with the next. We English people have to have everything connecting, or it just throws us for a loop in a hurry. And you can even tell that when you look at the way English sentences are set up. You compare that with the way we would say Hebrew sentences are not set up. But they are set up, just not set up to the way we would understand them, because you end up with the main theme of what's going on at the very end of the sentence, and by then you're lost. We've got to know right away, who are you talking about and what are you talking about? Then describe it to us. But they'll start off describing, like they're doing, describing all in verse 6 for what's going on. We think, what's going on? We don't even know who the what's going on with. But they expect us to read not as an Englishman, but as a Jew or as a Hebrew. So in the end of years, they, not Ptolemy I, Seleucus I, but people who are representatives of their dynasties, so their descendants or their successors. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north. There's the first time we have the phrase, king of the north, to make an agreement. It's a political marital alliance. We see many of these in history. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. A lot of difficult language, but I think we can easily understand that when we approach that matter. So what we have, though, before we can get down to verse 6, are some of these kings that verse 6 skips over. Whenever we go from the time period between verse 5 and verse 6, then the angel, and therefore the prophet, and therefore the record before us in Daniel 11, 5-6, completely skips over the rule of the second Seleucid king, Antiochus I, named after the father of the founding father of the dynasty, Seleucus, his father being Antiochus, and some of the names in this dynasty being Seleucus, and remember some of the names being Antiochus. The former of those coming from the founding father, the latter of those from the father of the founding father. So it completely skips over the rule of the second Seleucid king, Antiochus I. It skips over most of the rule of the third Seleucid king, Antiochus II, and over a good portion of the second Ptolemaic king, Ptolemy II. Remember, we're going to have to deal with a lot of numbers here, of Ptolemy, of Seleucus, and of Antiochus. And just wait till we get to Cleopatra, and then we've got to deal with Cleopatra as well. Not right now. Cleopatra will come on the scene later. So tonight I'm going to have to supply you with that information, that's extra material, before we can look at verse 6. So let's begin with Antiochus I, who also went by the name Soter, just as did the forefather. Antiochus I Soter, which means Savior. He's the son of Seleucus I, grandson of Antiochus no number, because he's not in the dynasty. You just start counting the numbers when you get in the dynasty. Some fathers like to think they're building a dynasty today. All those lawyers do. You look out beside those young lawyers, and it's always the 4th or the 5th, you know. James William Ball Smith the 9th, or whatever. Well, he's the son of Seleucus I, who falls in love with his mother, becomes ill with passion over her, which produces a problem in the empire, which causes his father, Seleucus, to surrender his wife, technically the stepmother of Antiochus I, to him in the year 292, plus the territory east of the Euphrates River, plus the title king. Thus, the ditto line from 292 running to 281, the northeast corner of your chart, extending eastwardly from Seleucus I Nicator. You see the ditto line from 292 to 281. It's because Seleucus I is a co-ruler along with Antiochus I. Seleucus I is a co-ruler from 292 to 281 with his son Antiochus I. And he becomes officially king in 292. Not sole king, but it's a dual kingship. If you have Thiel's book, which is the authoritative book on the mysterious number of the Hebrew kings, then his book was the book written in this century, as a matter of fact, Edwin Thiel's book, The Mysterious Number of the Hebrew Kings, which unlocked the secret to books like Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles in our Bible, particularly Kings and Chronicles, where you've got a whole lot of overrulings and overlappings of kings that don't make any sense at all. And you start adding up these years, and the years don't tally out whenever you get down to the bottom of the ledger. They don't tally up at all. But it's because of this one thing that, unlike modern times, we have a president, and then when that president is through, then a new president. There's no co-ruling presidents that go together. But ancient times, many times, as you can see just looking at your chart, there were co-rulers of a father and a son. The father would get on up in the years and turn the kingdom over to the son. But the kingdom does not come into his sole possession, that is, of the son, until the father dies. So this is the case with these first two kings. So he's co-ruler from 292 to 281 when his father's murdered. Seleucus I is murdered. He becomes sole ruler of the empire. He received the name Soter, which is like that of Ptolemy, forefathers of these dynasties here. He received the name Soter for his defeat of the Asia Minor Gauls. Remember studying about Julius Caesar fighting the Gauls? Well, that's way over in France, you know. But the Gauls were in Asia Minor as well. So he received the name for defeating the Asia Minor Gauls with a large company of elephants, which is not surprising because Rome in the Punic Wars with Carthage was known to have elephants brought against her by the Carthaginians. He then co-rules with his son, Antiochus II, from 266 to 261, when he dies in battle with the Gauls. You see, he liberated some of his subjects up in Asia Minor from the onslaught and the attack of the Gauls. And thus they conferred upon him this blasphemous name of Soter, or Savior, which is blasphemous to call a man that. So he finally ends up being killed in a battle with the Gauls in the year 261. Okay, that means Antiochus II comes to the throne in 261. I think we'll save him to discuss him later, because let's take Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, because he's ruling at the same time as Antiochus I. So switch train of thought in your mind from the kingdom and the king of the north to that and to him of the south. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. Notice how long of a rule he has. As a matter of fact, he rules as long as the next two Seleucid rulers, Antiochus I and Antiochus II. He rules by himself from 283 to 246. He co-rules with his father from 285 to 283. So if you want to add in the next 2 years, then he has a total rule from 285 to 246. Very, very long rule. Now he's the youngest son of Ptolemy I. We've already discussed him. The great patron of the sciences and the arts, education and learning down in Egypt. He's the youngest son of Ptolemy. He murders his brother at the beginning of his rule to make sure his brother doesn't murder him and take over the throne. You wouldn't want to be a king's son, except for the heavenly one.
Right. Yeah.
And he marries the daughter of Lysimachus as well as his own full sister. 2 people, not one. Now Lysimachus, remember, was one of the earlier generals. One of the earlier generals of Alexander. So he's got 2 plus wives. Very few of them were ever satisfied with the original 1 + 1 = 1 of Genesis 2. He marries the daughter of Lysimachus and his own full sister. One of the richest kings of his day. I said before that Ptolemy I had a great army, a great navy, a fleet that controlled the whole Mediterranean Sea. Ptolemy II begins trade with Italy, which is seen over in Acts chapter 27 in Paul's account. Grain from Egypt going to Italy, remember. He begins trade with Italy, which becomes important politically and economically speaking later in history. Now, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, is very important for several reasons. He's one of the most important ones, that I see on the chart for a while. Of course, excluding people like Alexander the Great, until maybe we get down to the time of Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, another important leader. I want to put several things up in description on the screen for you of what he's important for. In the first place, he bestows his name upon an ancient famous city of the Ammonites. Remember, we've even got cities, not just one, many, in this country that sound a lot like his name, Philadelphus. But he bestows his name upon an ancient famous city of the Ammonites, which is known as Rabbah, R-A-B-B-A-H. This was the capital of the ancient Ammonites, situated right here, up in the highlands of the Ammonite kingdom. He bestows his name upon it. The name changes to Philadelphia, and it becomes one of the cities of the Decapolis, the confederation of 10 Greek cities during the time of Jesus. And here on another map, you'll see it. We're getting to the time of Jesus, and you'll see it by that name as Philadelphia. Now, this is not the Philadelphia of the book of Revelation. That's up in Asia Minor, and we're talking about over in the kingdom of the Ammonites. Here's Philadelphia. He bestows his name upon it. Here's Jerusalem down here. This is Israel, Palestine, Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Philadelphia. Today it's Amman. It's the capital of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan today. Amman. I've been there. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. So he's famous for bestowing his name upon this city. Refortifies the city. It had been, dying since the time of the Ammonites, which goes way back to the time of King David and King Solomon. But it is revived. It becomes, again, an important city. These things may sound a little technical to you, but if you kind of remember this, and you remember the name is Philadelphia, I'm sure we'll come across that again later. We study the cities in this period during the time of Jesus, as well as church history, as well as today. Amman is the chief Near Eastern capital. It's the international capital for the Near East today. Beirut, Lebanon used to be, but not a lot of people like to go to Beirut anymore nowadays. But 10 years ago, Beirut was the international capital of the Middle East. And now, with the new Alia Airport in Amman that was just built 2 years ago, and it's a flourishing, beautiful city, and multi-million-dollar projects are going up everywhere, and the desert blossoms like a rose around it until you get a little further out, and then you see the Bedouins with their goats and tents going everywhere. But they have done a lot to the barren sand around them. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. So today it's Amman. Then it was Philadelphia. Earlier it was Rabbah. It was the kingdom of the Ammonites. So he's famous for bestowing his name upon the city. In the second place, he's famous for the completion of the erection of the ancient world's most famous lighthouse. The Lighthouse of Pharos, P-H-A-R-O-S. One of the 7 ancient wonders, man-made wonders of the world. It had been started, evidently, we don't have a whole lot of information on this in history. It's not around today. The remains of it are, but the lighthouse is not. But evidently it was started during the time of his father, Ptolemy I. So sometimes you'll see that the famous lighthouse of Alexandria, Egypt, of Pharos, on the island of Pharos, was built during the time of Ptolemy I. Well, part of it was, but it seems to be the case that it was not completed. The erection was not completed until the time of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. And as I say, it's one of the 7 ancient man-made wonders of the world. Of course, we're talking about Alexandria. This is made. We're not talking about Memphis. We're not talking about some of these other cities that have been important in Egypt prior to this time. The important city is Alexandria. Obviously, this is where Alexander the Great comes, puts his name on this region, leaves behind a large group of people. They're Macedonians. The Ptolemies end up down here, and you have this whole Ptolemaic dynasty that begins. So it becomes a very, very important city. As a matter of fact, the harbor, I'll show you what it looks like, to draw a little diagram just on the screen for you. The shore of Alexandria, if you lift this off and make this the coast of Alexandria, comes together with this being the Mediterranean, comes together, and it loops like that. And this little section here used to be an island. Now it's connected by a narrow isthmus to the mainland. On this side is the eastern port, and on this side is the western port. And both of them are still there in Alexandria today. The eastern port on the tip, if it comes together, this is the land, this is the sea, and then used to have an island right here with a point on this side and a point on this side. One to the northeast, one to the northwest. The northeast corner, this is where the lighthouse of Pharos was built. Primarily, the most important part of the port of Alexandria today is the western part. It's so busy that it ranks second only to Marseille in the southeast corner of France as being the busiest port on the whole Mediterranean Sea. And you know how many ports are there on the Mediterranean Sea, and you can probably think of some of the names. It ranks second only to the one in southeast France. I've sailed in that port. It's tremendous. The ships, you can't count them. There's so many ships. As you go in, they're coming out, they're coming in with you. As far as you can see, there are ships coming in. Did I see the lighthouse? No, because it doesn't exist anymore. It evidently was completed around 280 BC by one Sostratus, Sostratus, Sostratus of Cnidus, which is the place that Paul passed by in Acts chapter 27 and verse 7, on the island of Pharos, which was in the harbor of Alexandria. The territory, the land proper is still there, it's just not an island anymore because they filled it in to connect it to the mainland. Was 400 feet high, which was quite a feat of that day. 400 feet high, which was quite a feat of that day. That's why it was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. By the way, who knows the other 6 ancient man-made wonders of the world? Pyramids. We've got 2 of them right there in Egypt. The pyramids, Hanging Gardens of Babylon, they're not around anymore. The Colossus of Rhodes, I sailed in that harbor, and that's not there anymore. One of them's in Acts chapter 19, and I've been there as well. I've been by a lot of these. The Temple of Artemis, she's called by her Roman name Diana, but it should be Artemis in Acts chapter 19. We've already named the pyramids. That's 5. 2 others, the statue of Zeus on top of Olympia, and some mausoleum that's not too important when you compare them with these other 6. So it's got good company as being something extremely important, the lighthouse of Pharos. 400 feet high, a fire burned. Remember what it was, a lighthouse to guide people, ships into the harbor of Alexandria. A fire burned on top all night long every night. They didn't have lights, so they just start a fire up there. You can see it for miles if this thing is 400 feet high. In the Middle Ages, the Arabs, who took possession of just about everything, well, they took possession of all of North Africa, but in the Middle Ages, of course, the Arabs were in control of Egypt and Alexandria, and they built a mosque. This was so large, they built a mosque on top. They put the fire out and built a mosque on top of a lighthouse. It was destroyed in the year 1326 AD. So it stood for 1,000 years, for over 1,000 years. And in 1477, a fort, which is still there, which we sailed right past this past spring, was built from the ruins of the lighthouse of Pharos. I mean, you've probably heard of the lighthouse of Pharos from grade school, Well, now you know this is during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus. He's that important. Important things are taking place during his reign. So the fort is still there. That means the material from which the structure was composed that dates back over 2,000 years is still there. It's just now in a different form. So he's famous for renaming Rabbah as Philadelphia, and today it's Amman. He's famous for the completion of the erection of the ancient world's most famous lighthouse. Thirdly, Even more than his father, he's famous as a patron of learning, of the arts, the crafts, the sciences of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. He built a zoo into which he gathered animals from all over the continent of Africa. Exotic animals that were out of their natural habitat, I would suppose, by the time they got from one part, maybe from the tropics, to Alexandria. And it was during his reign, speaking of him being a patron of the arts and sciences and learning and education, it was during his reign that the LXX was begun. And we've explained this for you on lit tape number 51. Which I'll just briefly review now, and you can review it either as I speak, writing it down, or in your mind. According to the purported letter from 250 BC of Aristeas, Risteas, who was an official in the court of King Ptolemy II Philadelphus, he wrote his brother Philocrates a letter in which he described how the custodian or the librarian of this famous Alexandrian library, Demetrius, had brought to the attention of Philadelphus, the king, the need to have in this magnificent library that's got several 100,000 volumes in it, a good Greek translation of these Alexandrian Jews' Old Testament, but it's in Hebrew. It's written in Hebrew. It brought to the attention, according to this letter of one Aristeas, the need to have a complete library, because we're talking about the most famous book of these people, the Jews. And so we've got to have a copy, but it's written only in Hebrew. And so according to the story, if you remember some of what we've given you before, Philadelphus sends an envoy to Eleazar, the high priest, back in Jerusalem, and that corresponds on your chart, as you see. Not with everything they have written there, but I'll tell you the story the way Aristeas tells it in his letter. And he picks 6 men, 6 Jewish scholar scribes from each of the 12 tribes, 72 men, sends them along with a beautiful copy of the Torah down to Alexandria. And after wining and dining the Jewish scribes and each showing off his wisdom and parables and answering riddles and so forth, they're finally isolated out on the island of Pharos, the same island we've just been talking about, where over a period of 72 days they translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. When they bring it back before the custodian, their translations before the custodian or the librarian of the Alexandrian library, as they read it to him, as they dictate it, he writes things down. We end up with the Septuagint, the LXX, LXX being Roman numerals for 70, rounding off 72 scholars in 72 days, this whole process of what allegedly took place. Now, with a rare voice of unison, modern scholarship rejects this. Most modern scholars don't join together in believing anything alike. But here's one thing that conservatives and liberals join together rejecting this purported letter from 250 BC of Aristeas. Why? Well, in the first place, although we certainly do have a translation from this time, it only begins in 250 BC. The only portion, evidently, that was written during this time is the 5 books of Moses. The rest of it takes another 150 years to be completed. The second place, the scholars who make the translation from the Hebrew to the Greek are by no stretch of the imagination Jerusalem or Palestinian scholars. They're most definitely Alexandrian scholars who are trained in Greek thought, Greek writing, and Greek rhetoric. And when you know Greek, you can spot that in someone's translation. Now, we could agree with the notion that the Palestinian scholars speak Greek at this time. That's possible anyway, that they are speaking Greek at this time, although we're only talking about, less than a 100-year period after the conquest of Alexander the Great, which really maybe is a little too quick for people in Palestine to be speaking Greek. But just assuming, for sake of argument, that they did speak Greek, they would not speak Greek like the Jews down in Alexandria. The third place, The king is not concerned, the librarian is not concerned that they have a complete library and have a Greek copy of the Jewish Hebrew Old Testament. Who's the one coming up with this idea to translate? Well, the leaders in the Jewish community, the Alexandrian leaders in the Jewish community in Alexandria. They see that the people here no longer can speak Hebrew. It's their concern that we have a scripture, a Bible, the Old Testament, beginning with the first 5 books of Moses, a Bible that the average common Jew can read, understand, and comprehend. So it's not the notion of King Philadelphus. He's very important for being an educational patron of learning, of schooling, of the arts, of the sciences, but not to the point that he gets in good with God and with the Old Testament and tries to get it translated. The letter really was written 100 BC, not 250 BC, as internal and external evidence can prove. The letter of Aristeas. It's written in 100 BC, and by this time probably the whole Old Testament has been translated from Hebrew over into Greek. Well, I just meant to briefly review it. I think I told you the whole story again, though. But it's on lit tape 51 if you didn't get all of that down. We've told it to you there at least once before, and probably we've mentioned it on other occasions. Now, Ptolemy II is more favorably disposed to the Jews than was his father, Ptolemy I. Remember, Ptolemy I, according to the writings of Josephus, the first time he goes into Palestine, into Jerusalem, he takes 100,000 captives back with him to Alexandria, and they settle in Alexandria. However, Ptolemy Philadelphus, Ptolemy II, releases the Jews from slavery. Many of them were still in slavery at this time. Releases them from their slavery and from their bondage, by which he shows himself somewhat more favorably disposed toward them than did his father, Ptolemy I. Now, something you want to mark down for certain, we've already hinted at it in giving you the story of the translation of the LXX, is the following. That during this time, or it really begins in full during this time, the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, 285 to 246, we have the beginning of the tragic blend of Greek philosophy with the Jewish religion. And we're going to see this imprint on not only Jewish writings, but Christian writings from the fathers, the early church fathers, such as Origen and Clement, that come from Alexandria. We're going to see this later on. It's very tragic because the Greek way of thought, the Greek philosophy is 100% opposed to the Jewish way of life and to the Jewish religion. It emphasizes the body, it emphasizes the mind of man, whereas the Jews, their total emphasis is upon the total personality, the soul of the man, and his relationship to God. So it becomes very, very important for our studies later. Really, you can't understand, or you're left at least guessing, well, how can Origen, the scholar from the 3rd century A.D., how can Origen come up with the notions in his writings, and Clement and the rest of their school, but Origen, I guess, is the most famous name from the Alexandrian school of thought. How can he come up with these notions? Things where he is just explaining the Old Testament away left and right by means of allegory. That's the origin of that method of the interpretation of Scripture, is the allegory. How in the world can he come up with this? Well, that's the Greek way of thought that the Jews are reacting to. But during this period, because we've got these Jews mingling here, we've got 100,000 that come in the first time, and more, remember, come voluntarily after that, especially during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, who is a little more congenial to the people than was his father. So they're going to come down there and settle a good way of life down in Alexandria. But it's like the church living with the world today. You mix the world's philosophy with the religion of Christianity, and you end up with the perverted humanism of the charismatic movement today. The name it and claim it doctrine, the prime time religion doctrine, the same thing. It's perverted humanism. It's a compromise between the narrow way of the Word and the broad way of the world. Amen. You get that together and you end up with some of the Tulsa teachers and some of those people in Fort Worth that we have to cope with all the time. Well, I don't guess he can help his name, can he? But it just fits. Praise the Lord. Well, it goes back several thousand years. I mean, it goes back to the very beginning of time. You mix the devil's thoughts with God's thoughts, you end up with this hybrid compromise somewhere in between that Jesus says kind of neither hot and kind of neither cold, but lukewarm. He said, I'll spew that out of my mouth. That doesn't hold to the whole Word of God. Well, a little preaching on the side never hurt anybody. We go back to our chart. You do have something written in under Ptolemy II Philadelphus that, of course, is not given to us in Daniel 11. That's why we're adding these things in extra. That is his invasion of Syria in 275, which is a true reliable date. He invades Syria and Antiochus I in 275. Now, because of his naval superiority, and he owes this to his father, Ptolemy I, who built up a large fleet to control the Mediterranean Sea, because of his naval superiority, he's able to keep the war going until 272. But by this time, neither side has really won anything, and so he returns back home. Now, the conclusion to the one point that you have on your chart is not provided. You can either write it on your chart or your notes or both. 275, he invades, but they don't tell us on the chart what happened in the invasion. Well, really nothing. Not like what we're going to see whenever the same thing happens down in verses 7, 8, and 9. So he returns back home. The war is called off 3 years later in 272 with really neither side coming out as a clear victor. Okay, what I want to come to next, and perhaps last, we'll have to see, concerns the Jewish high priesthood. Now, why study remember what we're doing. We've got intertestamental period divided up into three parts. One concerning political aspects, another concerning social aspects, and another concerning religious aspects of the Jews between the Testaments, between Malachi and Matthew. Well, Jewish high priesthood, that's religious. Why study it here under political? Because it wasn't religious, it was political. One thing that the Jewish high priesthood between the Testaments is known for is its political base as opposed to the religious one that was ordained with the Aaronic priesthood in the first 5 books of Moses. So we studied here because that's where it fits. By the time we get down to 200 BC, we have the buying and the selling and the highest bidder for the high priesthood, and we have all types of problems. And that's why you see all of the various lines and names and different types of priests and different families, different houses, the house of Tobias and the house of Onias, and the Tobiads and the Oniads and so forth. That's why you have all that extra excess material. If you look in the center of your chart and then look to the far east, the far right. Jason, Menelaus, Jason, Alcimus, Judas, Jonathan, appointed high priest, and so forth. So we have to start back up with the northeast corner, Onias I. Question mark. Why? You see this follows the gray line. The gray line. You see the priests that follow, Simon I, Eleazar, Manasseh, Onias II, Simon II, Onias III. Well, at least down to Simon II, question marks after them. Why? It's because all of this material is shady. We don't have reliable source material to definitely and precisely determine the beginning, the end, therefore the extent of the reign of these high priests. You've even got it back on Johanan and Jaddua as well. And you've got a long skip, a long blank space between Jaddua and Onias I. Whether that really existed that long, we don't know. So in other words, we're not going to be real dogmatic. We can't be dogmatic. If you've never seen the sun, you were born blind. You can't be too dogmatic on just what the sun looks like. But Onias the first all the way through Simon the second, the material's a little shady. Now, I said you should have brought Josephus. Why? Because he really is the only one. The Talmud gives a little bit of information, but Josephus really is the only one who gives us a lot of material concerning Jewish high priesthood between the Testaments. You're certainly not going to get it from the Old Testament. It's already closed. You're certainly not going to get it from the New Testament. It's not concerned with the period between the Testaments. So let's start with Onias the first and see what we can say. What we were going to look at was Simon the first tonight. We're still going to look at him, but we're going to save some other comments about him for another high priest. Okay, Onias the first. When do they have him? A little bit, well, right around 300, it looks like, right around 300. He was the son of Jaddua, the father of Simon the first, according to Josephus. Now, the Talmud does give some things, but it's notorious for being chronologically mistaken. Josephus certainly isn't the best. As a matter of fact, we're going to come across some contradictions internally in him probably this evening. I'll give you the references. I know a lot of you have the writings of Josephus. If you don't, you really cannot be a student of the Scriptures without Josephus, because everything you read is always going to be somehow referring to Josephus and what he thought and what he had to say. Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, Chapter 8, Paragraph 7. Book 11, Chapter 8, Paragraph 7. And please don't get a condensed version. Don't get a condensed version of anything. Like a Reader's Digest Bible today. They do have them, but it's a condensed version of the Bible. Take out all that chronicle stuff, that's so boring or something. Book 11, Chapter 8, Paragraph 7. About the only thing you'd want condensed maybe is I see they have a little Kittle out now, instead of big 10-volume set of Kittle's Theological Dictionary. I've even got little Kittle. I think it's maybe $30 for one volume instead of for 10 volumes. And it has a lot that the 10 volumes have. A lot it doesn't have. But it gives a lot of good information. Well, it's also found in Book 12, Chapter 2, Paragraph 5, where Onias is mentioned as being the son of Jaddua and the father of Simon. Josephus even calls him the father of Simon the first, the just, J-U-S-T, which has for a long time been a source of problem and contention. Onias the first was a contemporary of Arius, king of Sparta. For this you'll need 1 Maccabees. We will look at this because there's an interesting reference here. 1 Maccabees, chapter 12. Well, the whole chapter is about this, but particularly verse 7 and verses 20 through 23. He's a contemporary of Arius, A-R-I-U-S, king of Sparta. Hopefully you know enough about Greece and the Peloponnese to know where the city of Sparta was, who ruled from 309, Arius, king of Sparta, from 309 to 265. So evidently their times just barely overlapped. Now what we have here in 1 Maccabees 12, the Maccabees are trying to renew an alliance with Rome and Sparta against the Seleucids around 145 BC. So in other words, what we have here in 1 Maccabees 12 is looking back to an earlier period of time. 1 Maccabees 12 dates around 145 BC. You have to get the whole context. I don't think we've got time to read that, but you take the first 5 verses, and it talks about the Maccabees trying to renew this alliance with Rome and Sparta, so they'll have someone on their side to fight against the Seleucids. Verse 7, on a previous occasion, a letter was sent to Onias, the high priest, from Arius, your king. They're writing to the Spartans here, acknowledging our kingship. And then so forth. This is what the letter was about. We get down to verse 20. Arius, king of Sparta, to Onias, the high priest, greeting. Now they evidently still had a copy of this letter this many years afterwards. We're talking about, over 150 years later. A document has come to light which shows that the Spartans and the Jews are kinsmen, descended alike from Abraham. Well, I don't think that's ever been able to be proved before. Now that we have learned this, we beg you to write and tell us how your affairs prosper. The message we return to you is what is yours. Your cattle and every kind of property is ours, and what is ours is yours, and we have therefore instructed our envoys to report to you in these terms. In other words, the renewal of the alliance between Sparta and the high priesthood at Jerusalem is confirmed here. Now, Josephus, in Book 12, Chapter 4, Paragraph 10, erroneously states, however, that this was written during the time of Onias III, which you see on your chart would be around 190 BC. And this is impossible because history knows of only two kings of Sparta by the name of Arius, and both had died long before this date for Onias III of 190. So there's one place Josephus is obviously making a mistake. As I look through my volumes, I see many no's and many question marks out beside some of his things. So he's not the most reliable historian for the Jewish high priesthood, but he's the only thing that we have to go on. That's why we have to look at what we have. Besides that, nothing else is known of Onias I. The second high priest we come to is his son, Simon I, that Josephus refers to as Simon the Just in Book 12, Chapter 2, Paragraph 5, which is a controversial section here. Book 12, Chapter 2, Paragraph 5. When Onias the high priest was dead, his son Simon became his successor. He was called Simon the Just because of two reasons: his piety towards God and his kind disposition toward his people. Now that description of him is really the only description, the only reliable one we have from Josephus. A twofold description that Simon the First, the Just, assuming that we're talking about Simon the First, and Josephus really didn't have reference to Simon the Second as being Simon the Just, was one who was known for his piety toward God and his kind disposition toward his fellow kinsmen. That will be important later on as we try to determine something else from something else about something else. He's also referred to in the Talmud as the last great teacher of the great synagogue. He's best remembered for his famous dictum, "The world rests upon three things: the law, love, and kindness to your neighbor." The Talmud even identifies the high priest that met Alexander the Great as Simon the First and not as Jaddua. We've discussed Jaddua now several times based on Nehemiah chapter 12 and verse 22 on who is this Darius the Persian, and how could Jaddua, if he's mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 12 and he is somehow a contemporary with Nehemiah the governor, and we know when Nehemiah lives, then how can he also be the high priest who, according to Josephus, is the one who greets Alexander the Great when he comes into the city of Jerusalem? So the Talmud tries to clear up what perhaps to them was a problem by stating that Simon the First was the high priest. But we've explained before how it's possible, very, very well possible, that Jaddua could have truly been the priest that greeted, the high priest that greeted Alexander the Great, and not Simon the First. Now Simon the First, look on your chart, you've got just, but you've got it in parentheses there. I think that means parentheses for not only his name, Simon the First, for being during this period, but maybe as an identification of this man, this Simon, being Simon the Just. What I mean with all of that apocalyptic literature and statement I'll cover later on, which was going to be our topic tonight. Eleazar is the brother of Simon the First, another son of Onias, and he's seen in book 12, chapter 2, well, I think the whole chapter of Josephus, paragraphs 1 through 15, which you may want to read. This is all about the account of Ptolemy sending his envoys to Jerusalem, to Eleazar the high priest, to send 6 scribes from the 12 tribes to translate from Hebrew to Greek the Old Testament, which we've discussed before. Manasseh is hardly important. He's an uncle of Eleazar. He's mentioned maybe once in Josephus, and practically nothing more is known about him. Now we're going to stop there because Onias II, if you trace him downwardly, that gets us into the time of Ptolemy III and Seleucus II, and that will get us into Daniel 11 and verse 6. So we'll just cover the high priesthood, we'll try to anyway, as we go along in order with the kings of the Ptolemies and the kings of the Seleucids. So now you know a little bit, and if you read Josephus, particularly his 3rd volume, which deals from which most of these passages have come that I've quoted to you or given you a reference to, don't be surprised if you get a little confused on all of the names of the high priest and who was the son of who and who was whose uncle and whose nephew, because he sometimes contradicts himself as you read from one chapter to another. You say, well, how can we even know anything? Well, we can't know very much at all. Not about this early period. As we get later on, we get down to the time of John Hyrcanus, and we know a lot more things of what's going on with the Jewish high priesthood. This is the time of the origin of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We know a lot more about that than we do in this early period of Onias, then of his son Simon, then of another son Eleazar, then of an uncle Manasseh, and then back to another brother or back to another son of Simon the First, Onias II. Okay, do you have any questions tonight? Well, someone is supposed to say it's all on tape.
Amen.
Praise the Lord.